Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for APQC's September KM webinar. I'm really excited. We're going to talk about knowledge management trends and predictions today. And a lot of what we're going to focus on is from our 2021-2022 KM Trends survey, which is hot off the presses. But in looking across the trends, we've really tried to pull in everything that we know from other research and things that we're reading, from all the conversations we're having with members and NKM experts, as well as all of the research that we've done over the last year to really give you a good picture of what we think is going on and where we think things are headed. So I think this is going to be a really exciting and fun conversation, and I'm really excited to get started. So speaking of fun, I have a very exciting special guest joining us today. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Lauren Trees. I lead the Knowledge Management Research Program for APQC. And our chairman and resident KM guru, Carla Odell, has agreed to join us and help me dig into some of these trends today. Hi, Carla.
Hi, Lauren. I wouldn't miss it. This is a celebration. We'll explain why.
Well, and Carla, you have been predicting what's going on with KM for probably more than 20 years. So you've got a good perspective on where you think we might be making some mistakes or some assumptions and things like that. So that's always good perspective to have.
Happy to share.
So I have a simple three-part agenda for our call today. We're going to start by talking about what's going on right now, the current state and prognosis of KM programs, some broader influences, society, technology, and so on that we see influencing KM, especially over the last year or two, and some opportunities and threats. We're going to do a little bit of SWOT analysis on the current state of KM. And then we're going to talk about focus areas for 2021 and 2022 in terms of the activities and approaches that KM teams are pursuing, in terms of the business priorities they think it's most important to support, as well as the technologies that you all think are most important to experiment and embrace right now. And then finally, obviously, none of us know what the future holds, but we're going to talk a little bit about predictions, technologies we think you should be paying attention to that are maybe a little bit further out on the horizon, and what kind of skill sets KM teams need to be developing now in order to be ready for that future state. And I do want to say, Carla and I, when we were planning for this, we have lots to say about these topics, but we really want to make this a two-way conversation. So I hope you guys will all get into the chat, into the Q&A, pose questions, answer questions, share examples, share thoughts as we go along. I think that will make it a lot more fun for us and for everyone involved. So feel free to interact, and I've got the chat up here. I'm going to try to pay attention to that while we talk.
And I'll do the same, Lauren.
Perfect. So we're going to start with a little conversation about the here and now. So what's changed in the KM space over the last 18 months, some of the drivers behind those changes, and then those opportunities and threats that I mentioned. So according to all of the KM practitioners, I think it was about 360 something who participated in our survey in July and August, the outlook for KM is really overwhelmingly positive. 60% of you said that knowledge management is either thriving or gaining ground, and I think only about 14% said you thought knowledge management was in decline or in free fall. So the vast majority said it was either sort of steady state or going in a positive direction.
Lauren?
And the data that I have here is really, and organizational investment backs that up. 2/3 of you say that your organizations will spend more on knowledge management over the next 12 to 18 months than over the past year. And reading through all of your comments on the survey and using that as a backdrop to this data, I saw a lot of the same positivity, especially in terms of KM becoming more of a strategic capability versus that back office function. So I think there's really a lot to celebrate and be excited about here.
Yeah, Lauren, that was what I was going to say. And we actually have a point from Kirsty about it, which is, has this changed as a result of the pandemic? And Kirsty and everyone, I can guarantee you it has. I mean, this this is just one indicator of the reason for celebration. You'll hear more that may actually be the underpinning of a remarkable future for KM, but we're celebrating the fact that knowledge management was there for the organization during the pandemic. And I think it solidified and gave us a platform we did not necessarily have before. So for that literally tens of thousands of people, including the 90 or so, that's 100 or so that are on this call from Russia to the US, congratulations. It took a lot of work to do this.
So, and again, to Kirsty's point, we have definitely seen more flux across knowledge management investment priorities, all of the categories in the last 18 months than we would normally do in that period of time. And I think that makes sense. I can't imagine why. Nothing's changed in the world since the beginning of 2020, right? And obviously, the downstream impacts of the pandemic have affected KM just like every other aspect of our lives and business strategy and organizational operations. But I wanted to try to untangle a few of the threads here, and some we'll kind of pull on later as we go along. I think the most direct impact is remote and hybrid work, which has really boosted the internal market for knowledge management. When you're in the midst of a crisis, you're hungry for information, you want the latest updates. And a lot of people, when you're working in your living room, you're disconnected from the normal ways that you got questions answered, that you accessed information in the pre-pandemic world. So a lot more usage of knowledge management systems, a lot more demand for better knowledge and information management systems for sure. And I think, as Carla was saying, we saw a real difference between organizations that had good KM infrastructure in place that could handle that pressure and organizations that were scrambling to catch up with that post-March 2020. And then at the same time, I think we're seeing how globally interconnected we all are, how fast market conditions can change. I think I was personally shocked by just how quickly things started to move. I think we all know we need to innovate faster. We're all sick of talking about agility, but we all know that it's a critical success factor. And I think we're dealing with some wicked problems that we really want to bring the collective intelligence, collective wisdom of the organization to bear on. So I think that, that's a big factor as well in terms of building people's interest in knowledge management and usage of some of those KM systems. We've seen organizations like Mercer that have global communities of practice really transitioning their experiences and lessons learned at different stages of the pandemic around the world as those stages hit. So I think you can really see that that global network being a huge benefit to organizations. And then finally, one that Carla and I have been talking about a lot lately is labor turnover and labor shortages. We're seeing people who've decided this is the right moment to retire. We've seen people who just can't or don't want to return to an in-office workplace, and that's creating some churn in the marketplace. And also, there's a hot labor market out there in a lot of industries. So you just have a lot of people who are maybe jumping ship for new opportunities. So there's a lot of knowledge walking out the door, and you may not have the exact right candidate to fill some of those roles. So that really creates demand for knowledge management in two different ways. You have some people who are maybe long tenured, who are exiting the organization. You want to capture their knowledge. You want to transfer their knowledge to successors. And then you also want to create some knowledge assets to help with training, upskilling, reskilling, and also augmenting the knowledge of the folks who are going to be filling in those roles. So I think there's a lot of things that are exciting that are going on. I explicitly did not include technology on this slide because we're going to get there. But Carla, what else did I forget in terms of these broad forces?
Oh, you didn't forget anything. We're going to talk in a few minutes about the impact of remote and hybrid work and labor turnover and shortage. But keep in mind the business and supply chain disruptions. I want everyone to keep that in mind because we have a point we're going to make on that later.
Excellent. So we asked on the survey about the biggest opportunities for KM to capitalize on right now. And I think so many of them reflect this inflection point in terms of, where we are. And obviously, number one is KM is essential as organizations embrace more remote and hybrid work. And we've seen that again and again in the research. And part of that, I think, is employees being frustrated with bad information management, confusing repositories. As the digital workplace becomes the workplace, that mess, I think, has an outsized impact on people versus when they could use some workarounds in the face-to-face office. But we've also seen, some really positive shifts in leadership thinking, more leaders recognizing and treating knowledge as a strategic asset. Carla and I have been shouting that from the rooftops for years, so we're excited to see that. But then also the pandemic highlighting to leaders some of the risks of knowledge gaps and silos. They're seeing the upside of doing KM right, and also some of the downside risk of not doing it or doing it poorly. And then the final one is really around this upskilling and reskilling. You may not be able to find the perfect person for a role, so you want knowledge assets they can learn from, or they can help support them as they grow into that role in particular. And Carla, you and I were talking, a lot of these feel very much of the moment, 2020 and 2021, but a lot of them are also things that existed before the pandemic. They've just sort of been accelerated.
I think especially we certainly have been yelling that it's KM is essential to remote or any sort of work, but I think that the pandemic has made that clear to everyone else as well.
Well, and several of these are really about leadership waking up and saying, oh, this is something that we should think about. And I think in particular, this emphasis on risk is really interesting, because I think people have not thought about knowledge risks as part of their enterprise risk management as much previously as they are now. Some of that has really become people are aware of it. Well, gee, if we only have this knowledge in one building and it's not on a network and people can't get to the building, well, we can't get to it. That's like a physical silo, in the middle of a global pandemic, and some things that just nobody had thought about. So I want to move on and talk about some threats. We also asked about the opportunities. We also asked about the threats. And what's most interesting to me about these threats, and I'll put them on the slide here, is that while the opportunities are very much of the moment, a lot of these threats that we see, at least 4 out of the 5 here, I think are really evergreen. They are a lot of the same things that we saw a decade ago when we identified the top 10 barriers to knowledge sharing. Employees are overworked. They don't think they have time for KM. Leaders are focused on what they see as more important issues. The culture doesn't incentivize knowledge sharing and reuse. KM's impact is hard to measure, which complicates funding and buy-in. I just looked at this list and I said, yep, time, sponsorship, culture, measurement, those are 4 of the top 10 barriers. So there's a little bit of, it was always thus. But I do think some of these challenges have accelerated or been exacerbated by the current climate. So I'd love to hear if any of you feel like there are particular threats that have become more threatening to you over the last year or two versus ones that are just kind of endemic to the knowledge management situation. Because I feel like between the exhaustion of the pandemic and people covering for other people who haven't been replaced in the labor shortage, there is a real sense of exhaustion in the workforce. And if you're asking people to do something more, and even if it's not more, even if it's new, people are so exhausted from constant change that is even more of an uphill battle than normal. I also think, it's interesting to me that the leadership focus shows up both on the opportunities list and on the threats list. And I have had very polar conversations with different organizations, with different cultures and different focus areas. For everybody I talk to who says this has been a pivotal moment, people have started to understand knowledge management. I've talked to another person who says, yeah, we've been put on the back burner because other things are going on that leadership sees as most important. And I would say that I think that KM programs that were really able to be agile, to realign around what the organization needed, especially in those first couple months of the pandemic, where they were saying, let's set up a community that can help us share lessons learned around what's going on, in the context of our business. Let's figure out how to help people with this juggernaut of virtual work and how to be effective and get things done. That those programs have had more of the opportunity upside than the threat downside on the leadership focus piece.
Lauren, we got a couple of very interesting conversations going on over here in the chat. Kirsty, I'll start with you again. She's, I'm going to paraphrase Kirsty, but they're working with internal and external programs. So we'll talk about external programs for a second. And she's talking about the support teams that work directly with external customers and any of these frontline customer facing things. And they're seeing a decline in their engagement right now. And so I think that's an interesting program. Any of the end user knowledge base users, some decline in that, and probably because they are the other group that's on the front line, as it were, during this pandemic. And those challenges have increased for them. Catherine had a really good point that touches a nerve, I think, for probably all of us, which is one of the biggest threats to KM right now, and I think employee well-being, is the information overload. And I think part of that's because we're so working remotely. I'm at home, look behind me, I've got it blurred out for personal reasons. Didn't clean up this morning, maybe. But you're using the same device for your personal work and your professional work, and you're getting emails and links all the time to buy this, do that, read that. And I think it's just exacerbated the information overload. We really are going to have to get better at managing our own infosphere. I know I am.
Yeah, I think that there is a huge challenge around that. I feel it personally when I talk to our, knowledge management members. A lot of them are struggling to get participation in things like virtual community meetings because people are like, I'm on so many virtual meetings, I don't want to go to another one. And so much knowledge management activity like that is not mandatory. So I feel like that creates a challenge for folks in terms of driving that engagement. But we're definitely going to talk about the engagement piece a little later, and I want to dig into that.
Mm-hmm. And Catherine had another point about the importance of engaging those regional and central networks, deduplicating knowledge silos. And you're going to talk in a minute, Lauren, about a finding we had, which was sort of surprising. So Catherine, stay tuned on that. You'll probably want to weigh in on it.
Yeah. And I like the comment about leaders may be KM advocates, but have different language about means for sharing information or connecting during the pandemic. I think some of the programs that have really been most successful is meeting leaders where they are, understanding how they're talking about some of these challenges, and really connecting to how some of those KM tools and approaches can help with some of the challenges that leaders are seeing, even if they're not seeing it necessarily as a knowledge management challenge. I think all of that's really important.
Mm-hmm.
And then the final threat here I did want to mention, which I see as a newcomer to this list, is the too many disconnected technologies in place to support KM. And I think that really speaks to the information overload piece that you're talking about, Carla. I just feel like people are building apps upon apps and repositories upon repositories, and nobody knows where to put stuff, where to store stuff, where to find stuff, and it is driving everyone crazy. I have not done a survey that has not told me that in the last year and a half.
Yeah, I think that's right. And everyone, you're doing a super job. I'm not going to respond to everything in here because you're doing that to each other. So let's keep this the knowledge management social platform private and alive. So you're doing a good job. This is very interesting.
Fantastic. And I did want, as we sort of contemplate these opportunities and threats, to say that for me, the ultimate impact of remote and hybrid work for KM is still unclear. And I think you can see that from a lot of the things that you guys are putting in the chat. There's upside and there's downside. And I do think that what we've seen in the research is, while the team-based collaboration with people who are maybe under one manager or in the same direct function has gone way up in these digital platforms, we're just not seeing the same trend in terms of cross-boundary collaboration, at least not to the extent that we thought we would. And I'm calling this slide things I read this weekend. Because if any of you have dug into the research on remote work at Microsoft that came out, I think earlier this month, it found those same patterns. And I've got the article from Nature Human Behavior on here, as well as a more fun Atlantic article that talks about the research. And they really found that the connections within those teams, the inbound team connections, really increased, but those loose ties, the people who are outside of your direct team, that really fell off a cliff in terms of how people were collaborating with one another. So while remote work has increased the appetite for information management, for team-based collaboration, I'm not 100% convinced that people and organizations are investing as much time and energy in that cross-boundary collaboration. And that may change, but it's definitely a red flag in my book. And the other article I have on here is just one of many about the surveillance culture, especially driven by remote work and organizations using facial recognition software and keystroke software and all sorts of things to monitor employees who are working remotely. And I do worry that this kind of level of surveillance, which in our research, younger workers are much more concerned about, is going to have a dampening effect on knowledge sharing, even if that's the kind of activity that the organization wants to promote. And one thing that our Atlantic article talks about is the value of water cooler chat and what you get out of gossip and eavesdropping in the office. And, one of the things about water cooler chat face to face is that it's not being aggregated and analyzed by the organization. So I think that's just one of those things to think about as we try to recreate some of this activity online. Just being real transparent with people about what you're monitoring and what kind of data you're using.
Yeah, could I make a point here, Lauren? There's the casual camaraderie of the office is one of the things that builds engagement for people, as you said. And it's also where the serendipity happens for innovation and the allegiance to the organization, not just the engagement in the work, the allegiance to the organization. So we haven't seen the last of this yet. There's one of the great things about remote work is that it gives, if you're not on Zoom calls all the time, present call accepted, of course, you're going to have more time for deep work and you're more likely to be disconnected. And I hope we don't see CEOs and others thinking that they made the mistake at Yahoo a few years ago. Well, people are not connected, so we're going to make them all come back to the office. I mean, they're not online responding instantly to my every request. And that kind of instant response may feel like productivity, but it's a disaster in terms of deep work and productivity.
And I'm so glad to see some folks in the chat saying that they do virtual water cooler chats and they've had some success with that. I talked to a couple of people in advertising who are using Clubhouse for those water cooler chats. So I think there's absolutely ways to do it. And I'm really excited that people are experimenting and finding some success. I just think we need to build on that, and it needs to be more widespread and kind of move beyond virtual happy hours that I think people are a little bit, burned out on and things like that. So that's great. So I want to move us along because I know we've got a poll next. So I'm hoping you all will respond to this poll. We've talked about the pros and the cons and everything in between, but I wanted to get a sense from folks on the call about which best describes the impact of remote and hybrid work on KM in your organization. Has it overall been a benefit, not really had a lot of impact? Has it hurt or drawn attention from KM? Or if you don't have a lot of remote or hybrid work and you don't think that that's been really a factor in your organization, I've got a choice for that as well. So Carla, what has your experience been? Where do you fall on this? The upside, the downside?
Oh, I don't want to influence the voting, but it seems to me it's pretty well drawn. It's done two things. It's drawn intense attention to KM. It's also caused KM to really collaborate closely with the technology organization, which is good. But as Tony pointed out, when he's talking about chief data officers, it's beginning to blur the lines, which may not be a bad thing. And it's what usually happens between KM and technology. I mean, 25 years ago, we thought we were telling people, you've got to put the people first and then pick the technology that works. Well, the technology is going to get picked for a lot of reasons. And so we have to make it work for KM. And I think that's a pretty dramatic shift.
Well, and the whole thinking about data and structured data and unstructured data in one picture, I feel like is exciting, but also a little scary.
Mhm.
Well, that's great. So 61% of you feel like it's helped or drawn attention to KM, and then only 13% say it's hurt or drawn attention from KM. And none of you said you don't really have remote or hybrid work. So that's an interesting one as well, at least for the subset of folks on this call. Well, I'm glad it's overall been a positive. I want to move us away from these opportunities and threats and talk a little bit about focus areas for the next year, get a little bit more tactical. And we asked respondents to our survey about the top 3 priorities for their KM teams over the next year. And we last asked this question a month before the pandemic, so I thought it would be interesting to compare those 2 data sets. They're different panels, so you can't read too much into it, but it's interesting to look at where those trends are. And I think in 2021, the top focus is really in a few areas. A lot of organizations are either starting or recalibrating in terms of their KM strategy or their critical knowledge. So maybe this is the first time they've done KM. Maybe they're reevaluating, recalibrating what they're doing. Expert knowledge transfer remains a huge goal. That's kind of an evergreen towards the top of this priority list since I've been doing it. And then so are collaboration, developing and managing content, and improving search and discovery. But I want to kind of dig in a little bit to where we see some of the rising and declining priorities and what we make of that. And I'm going to set this up for the audience that Carla and I are not 100% sure about what some of these trends may mean. So I'd love to get your perspective in the chat if you have thoughts, because I think some things have come down on the list that really surprised us.
Mm-hmm.
And it may just be noise in the data, but maybe there's a story there. So I gotta ask and see if I can figure it out. So I think, some organizations that are pursuing KM for the first time, that are trying to realign those strategies, I think the rising priorities make a lot of sense to me. We have organizations redoing their KM strategies, and really we recommend you redo that every couple of years anyway, and especially when something as big as the changes that have come in the last year or two. And then, identifying and prioritizing critical knowledge. And that's a critical part in line with the strategy. But I also think, Carla, to your point about information overload, organizations cannot manage all of their knowledge. They need to do some curation. They need to put some of those most critical assets in front of people first. Some organizations are looking to technology to do that. Technology can take you a certain distance on that. But I think some good old knowledge mapping, knowledge prioritization can really help you at the outset. Tacit transfer has inched up a little bit. I think that makes sense with the workforce demographic changes that we're seeing. And I see content management really rising on this list year over year for the last 3 or 4 years. Again, I just think that the content management and content access challenges are growing as our digital repositories grow and as all of the different apps and capabilities that we have and all these different silos and pockets of information, are just kind of reaching a tipping point where organizations really think they have to get their arms around them. So that's a good sign to me. And then, all of which is to say that the decline in search and discovery here was a real surprise to me, kind of a head scratcher. My impression is that people are investing more than ever before in search and discovery, and that's certainly what other research that we've done is saying, in hopes of solving some of these problems with a technology fix, better living through technology. So if anybody has any thoughts on that, I would be interested. And it looks like Jane is putting in some thoughts on why cross-collaboration came out lower on this survey, because that's another question that I have. So she's saying the climate right now is deep focus on your own work group delivering their work during the crisis. The energy of teaching about KM starts in your own organization, so that may be why cross-boundary teaching gets second priority. And I definitely think that that is part of it. People are head down focused on their own stuff right now. In a lot of organizations, and that can make things like participating in a cross boundary community of practice, sharing lessons learned with different project groups, it can make that more challenging to get people to spend some time on. And then the engagement piece is also interesting to me. Engagement has been on the top of this list for a long time, or towards the top. And it did go down, quite a bit. And I don't know whether that's just because with the digital workplace, people are utilizing these tools as part of their work, and KM teams don't feel like they have to do as much proactive engagement, or whether that's a red flag and something that we need to go back and pay more attention to and reprioritize.
Or if it's just part of the general sense of overload and apathy that happens, because as you pointed out, the tunnel vision that we get, that's what human beings do when they are under stress, either as a group or as individuals. So that is certainly why you're seeing some of this tunneling happen. And engagement could be about general stress. Time will tell. As Jane said, on some of these things, we hope it's temporary. One of the points I'd like to make about the cross boundary is, once again, and Chris and others have mentioned this already, look to the professional service firms for how to do this well. And I'm talking about not now during this tunnel vision sort of time, when everybody's focused on just what's in front of them. But when we start to deal with supply chain issues, then that's going to be one of the next big things. And I think, remember that chart that Lauren had of the graphic of 3, and one was the labor shortage, and the one in the middle was the remote work, and the one on the left was supply chain. That's where the puck is going, guys. Customer focused and supply chain. And for customer focused, the consulting firms professional service firms are always going to be our best examples of how to do that and breaking that ground first.
I think that's a great point.
And everybody's saying a lot of, just to give a shout out to people who are making comments, a lot of people are commenting, and we're all getting to read them. So kudos to you all. Subeda, thank you.
And some of the comments about search have really made me think, maybe some organizations are deprioritizing that from a KM standpoint because other groups are working on it, because they're waiting for some technology investments. I think a lot of people are kind of waiting on some shuffle out from, hey, is AI going to start working? And we're going to talk about that a little bit later. So I did want to look at these business priorities. We asked people not just what their priorities were for their KM team, but what business priorities they felt like it was most important for KM to support right now. And productivity is number one. And Carla, I know you have thoughts on this, so I wanted to ask you what your thought is about productivity topping this list.
Well, I think what we saw was an artificial bump in productivity in the early days of the pandemic. When there was the great resignation and the great retirement, and all these people left the workforce or just stopped working. Basically those two things. And so productivity naturally goes up, but the same number of fewer people doing the same or more work. And now the question is, that's not sustainable. We've talked about that in podcasts and in white papers. That kind of overwork is not sustainable. And so what's going to happen now with productivity? And I think that's part of what's driving it. Another one that Chris pointed out in the Q&A segment was that the impact of KM on the bottom line has always been an issue. I think we have a little bit less of a need right now on the because of the focus on productivity to justify it financially. You certainly see the numbers have gone up because people have faced validity. Executives have seen, I can't function without this. So for a moment anyway, we got to have some breathing room on it. But productivity is going to be serious to see what happens, especially as we start successfully hiring again. And I think that's a legitimate concern.
And we are doing a whole webinar in December on productivity. So if you want to dig into that topic, stay tuned. So the second one on here is around digital transformation and intelligent enterprise. I think we see a lot of KM programs supporting those goals, and depending who you ask, that can be the biggest opportunity for KM or the biggest threat for KM. Digital is getting a lot of buzz, a lot of funding right now. If KM can hitch itself to that star, then that's going to open some doors potentially. But KM is about more than just digital transformation. And I do think there's a legitimate fear that KM could get eaten up by these huge digital initiatives. And then the number 3 on this list is strategic integration or operating as one organization. And this is a funny disconnect in the data for me, seeing the cross-boundary collaboration go down as a priority, but seeing operating as one organization be a major business goal that KM needs to support. So that may represent an opportunity for some KM teams to reprioritize some of that cross-boundary collaboration and make a business case for it. I did want to mention quickly just a couple of things that are lower down on this list. I was interested that very few people chose cost savings. I think that really shows our, movement to a more strategic role for knowledge management. It's not just about how can we, save a few dollars here and there. And then this is the first time that I've added diversity, equity, and inclusion to the survey. I've definitely heard some buzz about people looking at knowledge management as a way to, support, equal voices within the organization. So I'm really interested to see how that plays out and maybe grows a little bit over the next few years. So we did include some technology questions, including the most important technologies to embrace right now. And obviously AI and machine learning and, for search and discovery, they play a key role here. But overwhelmingly, KM teams say that the most important technology is these team collaboration and digital workplace apps. So things like your Microsoft Teams, your Google Workspace, or anything that you use to tie that virtual workplace experience together. And I think what this tells me is that however far we've gotten with AI adoption, a lot of KM programs are still trying to figure out how to manage knowledge across all of these apps and systems in place. And even in organizations that have adopted something like Teams or in Microsoft 365, there are so many legacy repositories and software, and just figuring out how to make knowledge flow across this complex environment is so difficult, and it's often very fragmented and requires, more resources than KM teams have. So I'm interested to see how this plays out and whether AI ultimately is going to, how many of these problems is it going to solve and how many is it not going to solve? Because I think the jury's still out on that for me.
Well, we'll do a quick poll on it later and see what folks on the call think.
Yeah.
I do think, you're going to have AI to achieve some of these objectives.
Yeah. And that brings us to the final piece in this section. We asked, what is the most important theme for the KM user experience moving forward? And we included some of what I think of as some more technology-driven themes, like making the user experience more anticipatory, where you're delivering and recommending knowledge to users without them having to search, making it more personalized based on personas. But the overwhelming majority of respondents to our survey said the most important theme was either to make KM simplified, so it's less confusing and more intuitive, or in the flow, so directly embedded into the work processes and applications. And I think in terms of the information overload, in terms of the disconnected apps and repositories, that getting it directly where people work, when people work, so that it's accessible based on the task and the activity that they're doing, that is going to be so critical moving forward. And technology has a role in that, but so does good content lifecycle management and good processes, and some people stuff as well.
Lauren, Catherine had a question or comment. She'd like to learn more about how to push knowledge more effectively so it surfaces where and when you need it. And I think we have some good case examples for that. Like MITRE was one of the early adopters of anticipatory knowledge delivery. And let's see, who I think is Mercer also doing a fair bit of that.
They are. We did a white paper back in, I want to say it's a year or two ago, that really looked at that in detail. Shopify is a good example
Yeah,
of
yeah.
doing that, where they do that in the context of customer service agents. So based on the email that the customer service agent is responding to, it'll pop up and say, hey, here's some knowledge that might be relevant. So I think that that's kind of that kind of model. Certainly MITRE does a lot of that with by role. So, oh, you're a new project manager, here's some targeted things that might help you and things like that. So there's a lot of different ways to do it. It's and some of it does require some customized technology right now, and I think that's what people are looking to some of the off the shelf applications to start doing a better job of that over the next couple of years. So we'll talk about that more in the future section, I think.
Lauren, do we have a minute for you to respond to Tony's question? It's a good one. Did the KM user experience change or these priorities, or do you have a previous snapshot for comparison?
I just made up this question this year, so I've got nothing to compare it with, but it's a great question, and I'd love to see how this trends over time. I think that the simplified and in the flow have been important for a long time. I thought that maybe the anticipatory was going to be bigger here, but I feel like this is foundational and makes a lot of sense to me once I saw it.
Anita, when Lauren says we have a white paper, what she means is we have an article that goes into more depth on the slides that you're seeing now. And I think you have links to those in the back of the slide deck, Lauren, so everybody will get that.
I do, and I also mentioned the piece on, I think it's called Embedding Knowledge in Day-to-Day Work, and I will include that in the follow-up as well in case anybody's interested in looking more deeply into that. That's from a couple years ago, but it's still very relevant today, obviously. So, I know that we can't predict too far into the future, but I want to look at least into the middle distance and make a few estimated guesses about what's next. You've always warned me about not looking too far into the horizon, Carla, but we'll do our best. So as part of the survey, we asked everyone to type some predictions for the future of knowledge management. And I left that question deliberately open-ended. I wanted to see where people would go with it. And I was amazed. We got 274 free text responses, and they were really thoughtful and really interesting. I've been still kind of trying to dig through them and figure out how to share them with people in a way that would be consumable and useful. A lot of the predictions were positive and centered on the opportunities that we talked about earlier. A fair number of you see demand for KM growing, and AI allowing KM to better deliver on its promises by automating some of that knowledge harvesting and knowledge capture, by improving search and discovery, and freeing up some of the KM team's time to be more strategic, to be more innovative, to be more consultative, instead of having to do all the tagging and flagging and kind of more manual aspects of KM. Some people said that the labor shortage will continue to stoke, the KM fire that remote work has kindled and really drive that appetite. And a lot of people wrote about KM in their organizations getting closer to business functions, whether that's innovation or quality, and really developing kind of customized solutions for those different parts of the business. So I thought that was all good news. And then there definitely were some caveats and concerns. Some people feel like technology is outpacing the KM discipline, that KM leaders haven't done enough to blow things up and realign around these new capabilities. There's also real fear that management continues to see technology as the answer. Somebody said leaders will continue to see technology as the KM easy button. And I think that sums it up for me. And that KM is going to become a footnote in some of these broader IT projects. And then there were a lot of comments around measurement and ROI. They weren't necessarily positive or negative, but just that KM's hard to measure, and people are worried that in a data-driven organization, if it doesn't find compelling ways to measure itself and its impact on financial and operational performance, that will become more of a problem. And then there were several comments, I would say about a dozen, around really feeling like the name knowledge management holds KM back, and wanting to see KM rebrand itself for the next decade. So I thought all of that was interesting. Um,
Lauren, did anybody suggest what it ought to call itself? This has been a conversation, by the way, for 25 years, that knowledge management was a terrible title. Didn't make it up. But
I
yeah.
know, as Cindy would say, we don't manage knowledge, we manage the systems and approaches that allow it to flow.
Mhm.
Somebody's saying knowledge services, Richard, in the chat. So yeah, if anybody has any good ideas, I didn't see anything. People were more just kind of feeling like it needed a rebrand than they were putting forward any great advertising slogans.
Yeah. And I do think that organizations that have really solid KM programs brand it and name it in a way that resonates with their folks.
Yeah.
And it's only between us little chickens here that we call it knowledge management. They've branded it like Ellen said, we're calling it business transformation, and Zubeda is knowledge flow design, and Richard is knowledge services. So there's an infinite number of those, and the best ones fit the organization and resonate with people.
Yeah, and we've talked about talking in the language that resonates with leaders, also talking in the language that's going to resonate with your end users, and maybe building it into another program, whether that's digital transformation or process improvement that resonates with people. As long as you're doing it, it doesn't really matter what you're calling it, right? But I do worry sometimes when people rebrand, that they lose some of that holistic picture. So that's the only caveat there. If you just start calling it knowledge sharing, for example, then you may miss out on something. Or if you're just calling it intelligent enterprise, so the definitions are challenging sometimes, but you got to figure out what resonates with your audience.
Mm-hmm.
So we showed you earlier the top technologies for knowledge management to embrace right now. We also asked what people thought were the most important technologies to embrace and experiment within 3 years. And this is where you see AI really come to the top of the pile. AI is critical across applications, but my takeaway here is that the proactive recommendations in the flow of work, as we've been talking, even more important than building AI into search, for people and for content. So I think people really do want that anticipatory experience, that in the flow experience. And we've done a lot of work with Cognizant. They refer to this as their seek to serve model, where they have moved KM systems from, people having to go seek knowledge to where they automatically serve up that knowledge and insights to people and project teams based on what they're working on. And there's a lot of different organizations that have moved more to that philosophy, which I think is great.
Mm-hmm. And this, again, just bodes well for the need to understand how we're going to use technology in the future. And that's part of the rebranding, is what is the relationship between knowledge management and these technology innovations? Are we the recipient of it, or do we have a seat at the table on the selection and design of it?
Yeah, I think there were a lot of comments in the predictions about KM really needing to be part of those conversations and help design technology that's for humans and help bridge that gap. And I think whatever we can do to be part of that conversation and to drive towards that is good. And I think we're going to talk a little bit about that on the next slide.
Mm-hmm.
So finally, we asked about the top skill sets for KM to develop in order to meet current demand and prepare for the future. And I have included the early 2020 pre-pandemic data here as a comparison. And we thought if you have any thoughts on this in the chat, I'd love to hear it. And also, if you are working on developing any of these skill sets, we'd love to know how you're building them, whether it's, bringing in consultants, sending people to virtual or face-to-face conferences, doing formal training yourself. I'd love to just kind of know a little bit more about how people are building the skills. But it is interesting to me that change management and analytics skills have topped the list in both surveys. Of all the changes and evolution we've seen over the last 18 months, I don't think that this framework of dealing with constant change and needing greater data literacy has changed, although maybe it's become more urgent. But and I was saying this to Carla yesterday, I think the most interesting piece to me here is the jump in design thinking skills. And I think that's true for KM teams that are part of some of these technology implementations and designs that we've talked about earlier. And building technology that actually meets user needs and applying those empathetic design skills. But you can also use design thinking to design completely analog KM approaches. And it's also helpful for understanding, working with R&D and innovation and integrating KM into those business processes. So I think that's really exciting, the jump in design thinking as a key skill set.
Well, everybody sort of liked it before because it was a link to innovation and it was cool and it was fun. But when the pandemic identified all of the deficiencies that we had in the way we needed to interact with our technology, suddenly it was like, oh, we need to do a much better job of this, and KM's in a position to be able to help with that. And it's a wonderful skill set. I'm looking for if you guys can tell us. I'm very interested. So you're going to teach people change management. Let me tell you why I think that's important. McKinsey just did a very big study over literally hundreds and hundreds of organizational transformations, really big ones, like a total move from one industry to another, so on, or one that was, the digital transformation, which is equally traumatic to people. And they found the question they asked was, what % of the employees in the organization have to be actively engaged in that change process for it to be successful? And we didn't do a poll on this, but I was shocked at how high the number was. And compare that to how big your KM staff is. It was 7% of the entire organizational population needed to be actively engaged in the change process in order for it to stick. And not just a few leaders or advocates, strategically positioned. So I think part of the reason we used to, and still do, love community of practice managers and people who will lead communities is because they were embedded in the business units. People who know the business and so on can make up part of that 7%. I would suggest everyone just keep that in mind as we move forward. It's a big deal. There's a lot of rigor to their findings and the data and the process they use to discover that.
And Carla, folks are asking for a link to the McKinsey study. Hopefully we could include that in the follow-up as well.
We'll see if it's publicly available, I will.
And a lot of people are saying, yes, change management, behavior change, that is the biggest challenge. And some folks are saying that they've hired some people to help with that in the context of KM and digital workplace, which is great. My last thought here is we do see a decrease in the active listening and communications interpersonal skills as a key skill set to develop. And maybe that's because you already have those skills strong on your KM team. But as new people come on board and as the need for, different kinds of communication comes up, I just don't want people to lose sight of that. And one thing that we've found since the pandemic is online collaboration, online facilitation, active listening and communication does have some different nuances when you're, for example, running a remote or a hybrid meeting. So I just want to make sure that those skill sets don't kind of fall by the wayside as we think about things like, like analytics and design thinking as well. So we've got a final poll, and so I want to squeak it in before the end. We've talked a lot about this AI piece, and a lot of you have had great comments about it. I really want to ask, in your opinion, when will AI start delivering tangible benefits to KM in your organization? Either it already has, you're there, or you think that you're on the cusp, it's going to happen, in less than 1 year, maybe 1 to 3 years, more than 3 years, or you're just not sure, too soon to tell, it's not anywhere, on the horizon. And I wrote down a couple of quotes from the predictions section of the survey that I thought were great here. One was, as wonderful as technology is, like AI and search improvements, the media overhypes them and provides unrealistic expectations to our users. So I think that making sure that we manage people's expectations is critical here. And then just real comment about colleagues being so confused by all the technology and different places to put things, and the vendors keep making promises that AI is going to fix everything, but just not being sure when that's going to happen and how much you need to put short-term band-aids in place, or whether you need some longer-term solutions because that's further out on the horizon. So that's part of what really inspired this poll question, just to kind of get a sense of where people think they are. Oh, really interesting. So the majority feel like you're in that 1 to 3 years. So we're not quite there yet, but we're getting there.
I was 10 years ago, we predicted, let's keep our eye on AI, Well, I remember the conference was 2010, the 2010 Knowledge Management Conference. And don't lose faith, folks. We will once again be in person eventually for a knowledge management conference at APQC, because that's where the good stuff and the casual camaraderie and the serendipity in the water cooler can happen as too. But very interesting. I think 1 to 3 years may be pretty realistic for
I think
most
so too. I mean,
organizations.
obviously there's some early, I think the innovators are seeing some value already. The early adopters are starting their implementations, and we're just gonna see it go. But I think the ultimate impact, I'm not 100% sure, and how I think we still need to invest in people and process. That's for sure.
Yeah, you
So I
can't, you
know that
really,
we are almost at time. I do have some links to the survey report for the trends research. We've got a really great white paper that I think sums up a lot of the things we've talked about today, and a few more. Carla and I have been doing a Knowledge in the News podcast series, where we've talked about different news stories in the KM angle. So I wanted to advertise that to you folks. And then I've included a few pieces on hot topics like design thinking and innovation, and some pieces that we've talked about here. So I know we didn't really get any time for questions, but I feel like you guys have had a great chat, and we've tried to incorporate as much of that as we go along. If there's any questions in the chat, I'll follow up with those after the fact and see if I can connect you to some research and resources. So I know that we are about at time, so I just want to thank you guys all for attending, and thank you, Carla, so much for co-piloting with me. This was really fun.
yeah, it was great. You guys were fantastic.
Yes, I can't wait to go back through the chat and see everything that I missed. And I hope that you will all join us next month and throughout the rest of the year for the rest of the KM webinar series. Thanks a lot, everybody. Take care.
Bye-bye.